Right now, as you watch this, one of the most photographed buildings in the entire world stands completely and utterly empty. No workers rushing through its corridors. No office lights flickering on at dawn. No sounds of telephones ringing or keyboards clicking. Just silence. 22 floors of absolute silence in the middle of one of the busiest, loudest, most expensive real estate markets on the planet. This is the Flatiron Building, and its story is one of the strangest tales in all of New York City's long and complicated architectural history. Let me take you back to the very beginning, because to understand why this building stands empty today, you need to understand what this building meant to New York City over a century ago. You need to understand the vision, the controversy, the fear, and eventually the love that surrounded this impossible triangular tower from the moment its plans were first revealed to the public. The year was 1901, and New York City was in the middle of what historians now call the building boom of the century. Money was flowing into Manhattan like water from a fire hydrant. Millionaires were being minted every single week, and these newly wealthy titans of industry wanted one thing more than anything else. They wanted buildings, not just any buildings. They wanted buildings that would make their competitors weep with jealousy. They wanted buildings that would make European visitors gasp in disbelief. They wanted buildings that would stand as monuments to American ambition and American power and American money. Into this environment stepped a man named Daniel Burnham. Now, Burnham was not from New York. He was from Chicago, and that fact alone made certain New York architects absolutely furious. How dare this outsider come into their city and design their buildings? But Burnham had something that New York architects of that era could not compete with. He had experience building tall. He had already designed some of the most impressive structures in Chicago. He understood steel frame construction in ways that New York builders were only beginning to grasp. And most importantly, he had a vision for a building that would sit on one of the strangest pieces of land in all of Manhattan. The lot in question was located at the intersection of 5th Avenue and Broadway at 23rd Street. Now, if you know anything about Manhattan's grid system, you know that most of the island is laid out in neat rectangular blocks. Streets run east to west. Avenues run north to south. Everything is orderly and predictable, but Broadway does not follow this pattern. Broadway cuts diagonally across the entire island, slicing through the grid at odd angles, creating strange triangular lots wherever it intersects with the regular street pattern. The lot at 23rd Street was one of these triangular orphans. It was shaped like a slice of pizza or the prow of a ship, or as people would eventually say, like a clothing iron. The pointy end faced north where 5th Avenue and Broadway converged. The flat end faced south along 22nd Street. For years, nobody knew what to do with this awkward piece of land. It seemed unbuildable, too narrow at one end, too odd in shape, too challenging for traditional construction methods. But Daniel Burnham looked at this triangular lot and saw opportunity. He saw a chance to create something that had never been built before. He saw a chance to make history. The design he created was revolutionary in multiple ways. First, he chose to build tall, 22 stories tall to be exact, making it one of the tallest buildings in New York City at the time of its completion. Second, he chose to follow the shape of the lot exactly. Rather than trying to fight against the triangle, he embraced it. The building would be triangular. It would come to a point at the north end that was barely 6 feet wide. 6 feet. That is narrower than many hallways. That is narrower than some elevator cars. And Burnham planned to stack 22 stories on top of this impossibly narrow point. Construction began in 1901, and New Yorkers watched with a mixture of fascination and horror. The steel skeleton rose floor by floor, and as it grew taller, the building seemed to defy physics itself. Surely this narrow tower would topple in the first strong wind. Surely the structure would buckle under its own weight. Surely this Chicago architect had made a terrible miscalculation that would end in disaster. The newspapers of the time ran story after story predicting catastrophe. They quoted structural engineers who claimed the building was fundamentally unsafe. They interviewed pedestrians who refused to walk on the sidewalks near the construction site. They published illustrations showing what the collapse might look like, with steel beams tumbling down onto crowded streets below. But Burnham knew something that his critics did not. He understood that steel frame construction was not like traditional load-bearing masonry. In a steel frame building, the exterior walls carry no weight at all. They are just curtains hung on a strong steel skeleton, and that skeleton, if designed correctly, could be incredibly strong despite appearing impossibly thin. The Flatiron Building's steel frame was designed to withstand wind forces 4 times stronger than any storm that had ever been recorded in New York City. It was over-engineered to an almost ridiculous degree, precisely because Burnham knew people would be watching and doubting and waiting for it to fail. The building was completed in 1902, and it did not fall down. It did not sway dangerously in the wind. It did not crack or buckle or crumble. It simply stood there, tall and proud and impossibly thin, a monument to the new age of steel construction that was transforming American cities. And New Yorkers fell in love. Within months of its completion, the Flatiron Building became the most photographed structure in New York City. Postcards featuring its distinctive triangular shape sold by the millions. Artists set up their easels on nearby sidewalks to paint it from every conceivable angle. Photographers spent hours waiting for the perfect light to capture its unusual profile against the sky. The building also created an unexpected phenomenon that became famous in its own right. Because of its triangular shape and its position at the intersection of 2 major streets, the Flatiron Building funneled wind in strange and powerful ways. Strong gusts would sweep around the building's narrow point and blast down the adjacent sidewalks with surprising force. These gusts were strong enough to lift women's skirts in an era when such exposure was considered extremely scandalous. Young men quickly figured out that the best place in New York to catch a glimpse of a woman's ankle was on the sidewalk near the Flatiron Building on a windy day. They would gather in groups, waiting for the wind to blow. Police officers were assigned to patrol the area and shoo these men away. The phrase, 23 skidoo, supposedly originated from police officers telling loiterers to skidoo from the 23rd Street area. Whether this etymology is accurate or apocryphal, the story became part of the Flatiron Building's mythology, adding to its fame and notoriety. For over a century, the Flatiron Building remained one of New York's most beloved landmarks. It survived the Great Depression when so many other buildings were torn down or fell into disrepair. It survived the massive urban renewal projects of the mid-20th century when entire neighborhoods were demolished in the name of progress. It survived the financial crises and real estate busts that periodically swept through Manhattan like hurricanes. The building changed hands numerous times over the decades. Different owners came and went. Different tenants occupied its triangular floors, publishing companies, insurance firms, technology startups in later years. The mix of businesses that called the Flatiron Building home changed with the times, but the building itself remained constant, its distinctive silhouette a reassuring presence in the ever-changing Manhattan skyline. But then something happened that set in motion the chain of events that would eventually leave this iconic building completely empty. In 2009, a group of investors purchased the Flatiron Building with big plans for its future. These investors included the Sorgent Group, an Italian real estate company, along with several American partners. At first, everything seemed fine. The building continued to operate as it always had, with tenants occupying the floors and rent payments flowing to the new owners. But behind the scenes, relationships between the various owners were beginning to sour. Real estate partnerships are complicated things. They involve huge amounts of money, egos that often match the size of the buildings being purchased, and complex legal agreements that attempt to anticipate every possible disagreement and conflict. When these partnerships work well, they can accomplish amazing things. When they go bad, they can become nightmares that drag on for years. The Flatiron Building partnership went bad. The exact details of what went wrong depend on who you ask. Different parties in the dispute tell different stories, but the basic outline is this. The partners could not agree on what to do with the building. Some wanted to renovate it and continue using it as office space. Others wanted to convert it to residential use. Still others wanted to sell it entirely and take their profits. These disagreements might have been resolved through negotiation and compromise if the relationships between the partners had remained civil. But they did not remain civil. Accusations flew back and forth. Lawsuits were filed. Counterclaims were made. What should have been a straightforward business discussion turned into a bitter legal war that would eventually require court intervention to resolve. Meanwhile, the building itself suffered. When owners are fighting with each other, they tend to stop investing in their property. Why pour money into a building when you might be forced to sell your share at any moment? Why maintain systems and make repairs when your partners might sue you for spending partnership funds? This kind of uncertainty is poison for real estate, and the Flatiron Building was drinking deeply from the poisoned well. Tenants began to leave. Some moved out when their leases expired, choosing not to renew because they could sense the instability in building management. Others were forced out as the building systems deteriorated and working conditions became less pleasant. By the end of 2019, the last tenant had packed up and moved out. The Flatiron Building, one of the most famous office buildings in the world, was completely empty for the first time in its entire history. Think about that for a moment. For 117 years, the Flatiron Building had been occupied. Through 2 world wars, through the Spanish flu pandemic of 1918, through the Great Depression, through countless recessions and booms and busts, someone had always been working inside this building. And now, suddenly, no one was. The emptiness was eerie. Photographers who had spent their careers capturing the Flatiron Building from the outside now found themselves documenting something strange and unsettling. A landmark with no lights in its windows at night. The building that had always glowed with activity now sat dark against the Manhattan skyline, a gap where illumination should have been. But the story was far from over. The legal battles between the owners continued even as the building sat empty, and these battles were about to take a turn that no one expected. In 2023, a New York court finally intervened decisively in the ownership dispute. The judge ruled that since the partners could not agree on what to do with the building would have to be sold at auction. This was a drastic step, essentially forcing a divorce between partners who could no longer coexist. The proceeds from the sale would be divided according to each partner's ownership stake, and everyone would go their separate ways. The auction was scheduled for March 2023, and it generated enormous interest in the real estate community. The Flatiron Building was one of the most famous buildings in the world. It was a designated New York City landmark and a National Historic Landmark. It was featured in countless movies and television shows. It was reproduced on countless souvenirs and postcards. Whoever purchased this building would own a piece of American architectural history. Several bidding groups expressed interest. Some were backed by foreign investors eager to own a prestigious Manhattan property. Others were American real estate developers with plans for converting the building to luxury residential use. Still others were investors looking for a trophy property that would enhance their portfolio and their reputation. On the day of the auction, the bidding was fierce. Numbers climbed higher and higher. In the end, a consortium led by Jeff Gurel, chairman of GFP Real Estate, emerged as the winner with a bid of $190 million. $190 million for a building that was completely empty and had been mired in ownership disputes for years. It seemed like a triumphant moment. Finally, the Flatiron Building would have owners who actually agreed on what to do with it. But then things got complicated. One of the members of the winning bidding consortium was a firm called Jacob Garlick, and Jacob Garlick, it turned out, did not have the money. The firm had agreed to contribute its share of the purchase price, but when it came time to actually write the checks, the funds were not there. The deal was in jeopardy. What followed was a period of chaos and uncertainty. Would the sale be voided entirely? Would a new auction have to be held? Would the building revert to the feuding owners who had been forced to sell it in the first place? Lawyers scrambled to find solutions. Court hearings were scheduled. Everyone held their breath to see what would happen. Eventually, a solution was found. Jacob Garlick was removed from the consortium, and the remaining members agreed to cover the shortfall. Jeff Gurel and his partners would own the Flatiron Building after all, but the drama surrounding the sale had added yet another chapter to the building's increasingly bizarre recent history. Now the question became, what would the new owners do with this empty landmark? The answer was ambitious. GFP Real Estate announced plans to completely renovate the Flatiron Building and convert it from offices to residential use. The building would be transformed into luxury condominiums, with apartments selling for prices that would make ordinary New Yorkers weep. Only in Manhattan could a building that had sat empty for years, that had been dragged through courts and auctions and failed deals, emerge as the site of some of the most expensive apartments in the city. But converting the Flatiron Building to residential use was not going to be simple. The building was designed as an office building, and office buildings are fundamentally different from residential buildings in dozens of ways. The floor plates, the core layouts, the mechanical systems, the elevator configurations, all of it would need to be rethought and redesigned. And then there was the matter of the building's historic status. The Flatiron Building is not just any old structure that can be modified at will. It is a designated landmark, which means that any changes to its exterior must be approved by the New York City Landmarks Preservation Commission. The building's distinctive facade, with its limestone and terracotta ornamentation, must be preserved. The triangular shape that makes the building famous cannot be altered. The windows, the cornices, the decorative elements, all of it must be maintained even as the interior is gutted and rebuilt. This kind of historic preservation adds enormous complexity and cost to any renovation project. Contractors must use specialized techniques and materials that match the original construction. Architects must find ways to incorporate modern amenities without disrupting the building's historic character. Every decision must be reviewed and approved by preservation officials who have the power to reject any change they deem inappropriate. The new owners estimated that the renovation would cost hundreds of millions of dollars on top of the already substantial purchase price. When finished, the building would contain approximately 40 residential units, ranging from relatively modest apartments to sprawling full-floor penthouses. Prices were expected to start in the millions and climb from there. And so the Flatiron Building sits empty today, waiting for this transformation to begin. Workers have not yet begun the massive task of converting this office building into homes. The floors that once bustled with clerks and executives and receptionists are silent and still. The elevators that carried thousands of people up and down every day sit motionless in their shafts. The windows that once glowed with the light of productive enterprise now reflect only the sun and the surrounding skyscrapers. It is a strange fate for such a famous building. The Flatiron was built to be used to house commerce and industry to contribute to the economic life of the city. For over a century, it fulfilled this purpose admirably. And now it serves no purpose at all, at least temporarily. It is a monument waiting for its next chapter. But perhaps this emptiness is fitting in a way. The Flatiron Building has always been as much about appearance as about function. People have always loved it for how it looks, not for what happens inside. The building's fame comes from its distinctive triangular shape, from its position at a prominent intersection, from its role in the visual identity of New York City. What occurred within its walls was always secondary to what it represented as a physical presence in the urban landscape. And the building is still performing this function magnificently. Every single day, tourists from around the world gather on the sidewalks near the Flatiron Building to take photographs. They pose in front of its narrow point. They marvel at its seemingly impossible shape. They try to capture its essence in images they will share with friends and family back home. The building does not need to be occupied to serve this purpose. It does not need lights in its windows or workers at its desks. It just needs to exist, to stand where it has stood for over 120 years, to be itself. There's also something poignant about the building's emptiness in our current moment. The Flatiron Building was designed for a particular kind of work, the kind of work that required people to gather together in offices, to share physical space, to interact face-to-face. This kind of work is now under threat. The pandemic of 2020 demonstrated that many office jobs can be done remotely, from home, without ever stepping foot in a traditional workplace. Office buildings across America are struggling with high vacancy rates as companies downsize their physical footprints and embrace hybrid work arrangements. The Flatiron Building's conversion to residential use is, in a sense, a recognition of this shift. The building that helped define New York's office culture for over a century is abandoning that function entirely. It will no longer house businesses. It will house people, families, residents who have chosen to make their homes in one of the city's most unusual and distinctive structures. This transformation says something profound about how cities evolve. Buildings that were designed for one purpose are constantly being adapted for others. Factories become loft apartments. Churches become restaurants. Warehouses become art galleries, and office towers become residential condominiums. The physical structure remains, but its meaning and function changes completely. The Flatiron Building of 2025 will be fundamentally different from the Flatiron Building of 1902, even though the exterior will look almost exactly the same. There's also the question of what this building means to New York City's sense of itself. The Flatiron Building is not just another skyscraper. It is an icon, a symbol, a shorthand for the city as a whole. When people think of New York architecture, they think of the Flatiron Building alongside the Empire State Building and the Chrysler Building and the Statue of Liberty. These structures are part of the city's identity, woven into its mythology and self-image. What does it mean when such an iconic building sits empty? Does it suggest decline, stagnation, failure? Or does it represent transition, transformation, renewal? The answer probably depends on your perspective and your politics. Pessimists will see the empty Flatiron Building as a symptom of urban decay, evidence that even New York's most famous landmarks are not immune to the forces tearing at American cities. Optimists will see it as a pause between chapters, a brief intermission before the next act in a continuing story of reinvention and resilience. The truth is probably somewhere in between. Cities are complicated, and single buildings, no matter how iconic, can only tell part of the story. The Flatiron Building's emptiness is a result of specific circumstances: a dysfunctional ownership structure, years of legal battles, a failed auction bid, the complexities of landmark preservation, and the economics of real estate development. These factors came together to create a situation where one of the world's most famous buildings sits vacant. Different factors in different combinations might have produced a completely different outcome. But there is something undeniably melancholy about walking past the Flatiron Building today. If you have been to New York before, if you have seen this building bustling with activity, the contrast is stark. The empty windows, the quiet lobbies, the sense of suspended animation, of time standing still inside while the city rushes by outside. It feels wrong, like seeing a celebrity who has fallen on hard times, like visiting a once great restaurant that has closed its doors. And yet the building endures. It has stood through everything the 20th century threw at it. It has survived owners who loved it and owners who neglected it. It has survived economic booms and economic busts. It has survived changes in architectural fashion that made its Beaux Arts style seem dated and then made it seem cool again. The Flatiron Building is a survivor, and survivors do not give up easily. The renovation will happen. The residential conversion will proceed. Eventually, people will move into this building and make it their home. They will wake up in triangular apartments and make coffee in triangular kitchens and look out triangular windows at the city below. They will become the next chapter in a story that began over 120 years ago when an architect from Chicago looked at an impossible piece of land and imagined something extraordinary. Perhaps the lesson of the Flatiron Building is that great architecture transcends its immediate circumstances. The building was controversial when it was built, with critics predicting it would collapse. The building is controversial now, with critics wondering if luxury condominiums are the highest use for such a historic structure. But the building itself remains unchanged in its essential character. It is still triangular. It is still tall and thin and defiant. It is still one of the most distinctive silhouettes in a city famous for distinctive silhouettes. The emptiness will pass. The emptiness is temporary, but the building is as close to permanent as anything in this impermanent world. A century from now, people will still be photographing the Flatiron Building from the surrounding sidewalks. They will still be marveling at its shape and its history and its stubborn persistence. They might not remember the legal battles or the failed auctions or the years of vacancy. They will just see the building, standing where it has always stood, a monument to ambition and imagination and the endless human drive to build something that will outlast us all. This is the story of why New York's most famous tower is totally empty. It is a story of vision and conflict, of money and law, of preservation and transformation. It is a story that is still being written, with chapters yet to come that no one can predict. But through it all, the building remains. The Flatiron Building remains. And it will remain long after the current controversies are forgotten, long after the current owners have sold their stakes and moved on, long after we are all gone and new generations are standing on those same sidewalks, cameras in hand, trying to capture something of the magic that Daniel Burnham created over a century ago on an impossible triangular lot at the corner of 5th Avenue and Broadway. The wind still blows around the building's narrow point, just as it did in 1902. The sun still strikes the limestone facade at different angles throughout the day, creating shadows and highlights that photographers have been documenting for generations. The city still flows around the building like water around a rock in a stream, taxis and pedestrians and delivery trucks all navigating the streets that converge at this singular point. And inside silence, inside emptiness, inside the pause between what was and what will be, the Flatiron Building waits, patient and eternal, for its next chapter to begin. It has waited before, it will wait again. Because great buildings are built for the ages, and the ages move slowly, 1 year at a time, 1 decade at a time, 1 century at a time. This is the Flatiron Building. This is why it stands empty, and this is why it matters.